Well, the road to Congress had started to look more promising for Democrats this summer, but recent polling shows Republicans are bouncing back, and they've done so by zeroing in on crime rates, for one thing, which, of course, increased in some areas after the pandemic and during the pandemic. In Pennsylvania, GOP candidate for Senate Dr. Mehmet Oz attacked Democratic rival John Fetterman's record on crime, as well as his health. Fetterman pushed back on Oz's attacks on Joy Reid's The Readout on Tuesday. Let's watch that.
It's the Oz rule. You know, when he's on TV, he's lying, and he lies about my record on crime. But the truth is that we in Braddock, as mayor, in a community with significant gun violence issues, I ran to be mayor for that reason. And for 5.5 years, we stopped the killing and the gun violence. We stopped it.
This week, the Cook Political Report moved the Pennsylvania race from the leaning Democratic column back to toss-up. And then the Senate race in the battleground state of Wisconsin is also very tight. Republicans there are hammering Lieutenant Governor and Democratic candidate for Senate Mandela Barnes for being purportedly soft on crime. Democrats have tried to shake off the soft on crime profile, but will it be sufficient to sway voters' minds in their favor come November? The Hill's Julia Manchester joins us now to weigh in. Julia, welcome back to Rising.
Thank you for having me, Robbie.
So you were just telling me that you are really zeroing in on Pennsylvania, where ostensibly Republicans have what someone that everyone kind of concedes, including Republicans, is a really uniquely lousy candidate, Dr. Oz. But you have seen the polls tightening up some. What explains that?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Talking to Democrats and Republicans in Pennsylvania, the Cook Political Report shift was not a surprise to them. They said, look, as we get closer to Election Day, it's going to narrow because Pennsylvania is such a tight purple state. I mean, I think that President Trump in 2016 and President Biden in 2020 very narrowly both won the state. So it's going to be tough for either candidate that's running. However, I think most people on the Democratic side I talked to, and maybe some independent observers, would say, you know, John Fetterman probably has the better chance. Look, yeah, he's the lieutenant governor. You know, he doesn't necessarily have an incumbent's advantage, but he is known statewide in that way. But we're seeing Dr. Oz, and this is very fascinating, zero in on crime in particular. And we've seen Dr. Oz go to places like neighborhoods in Philadelphia in particular, the urban areas of Philadelphia, and talk about crime, talk about drug reform, that kind of a thing. And that's sort of at first caught my attention because you would expect a Republican candidate maybe not to go into the inner cities of places that lean Democratic. And although I don't think the Oz campaign is under any illusion that they're going to win Philadelphia itself, I think it definitely projects this message that Republicans have nationally that they are zeroing in on crime. And he is saying that crime in areas like Philadelphia is high because of Democrats like John Fetterman.
Yeah, and crime in Philadelphia is astronomical right now. It's as high as it was like in the 90s. It's one of the worst affected cities right now by rising crime. Fetterman obviously is kind of held back at the moment from maybe making a full-throated defense of his policies or what he thinks because of his health issues that have, I think, really impacted his ability to communicate. Have you seen, you know, that having an effect? Obviously, he's not doing. What did he agree to do? One debate, I think, with Oz or something, and that hasn't taken place yet. But he really, his team seems to be keeping his appearances very limited.
Yeah. So the one debate he has is actually by our parent company Nexstar in Harrisburg on October 25th. They've gotten some pushback from that because Republicans say that's too late because early voting has already started, whereas Fetterman and Democrats will say, well, that's the time when voters who are going to vote in person, in general, the majority of voters are really starting to pay attention to the race. So there's been some pushback there. You know, I would say that recently we actually have seen an uptick in Fetterman's appearances. I mean, is he doing events every single day? Not necessarily, but, you know, he's doing interviews with MSNBC, holding those rallies. It's still very controlled, and the campaign has said, look, you know, it's still a recovery process for him from the stroke he suffered from in May, but you are starting to see him take up those appearances, and I think he's going to have to. I mean, over the summer, his digital team did a very good job at, you know, essentially trolling Oz and trying to keep the race in the headlines. I mean, we at The Hill were writing a number of stories on this race, despite the fact that it was the quiet period of the summer before the campaign. campaigns. So they did a good job then, but you can't run a purely digital campaign less than 30 days out from Election Day. So Fetterman's going to have to start making these more public appearances. He is doing that, but maybe not to the extent that other candidates would.
We're zeroing in on Pennsylvania, obviously in part because this is one of a small number of races that are going to decide whether our 50-50 Senate ends up 51-49, 52-48, or stays 50-50, what's going to happen. Other races, obviously, we're looking at are Georgia, which has had a lot of news recently because of the alleged scandals surrounding Herschel Walker, which I don't know what your sense of that is, whether that makes him, even less likely to. It's very close. My sense was that Raphael Warnock, the Democratic challenger, was a little bit ahead, probably more ahead now. Or what do you think this is going to make much of a difference in the race?
It possibly could, maybe with Democratic-leaning independent voters. However, if you're concerned about inflation, crime, and the situation at the southern border, which are three issues that Herschel Walker has been talking about, I don't know if a personal issue like this will necessarily impact voters or sway voters. I will say I think Raphael Warnock is definitely in the lead, and you actually haven't seen Warnock and Democrats make that many public statements about this because they want to, in their words, really focus on the issues. What I could see Warnock doing, what he has been doing, is focusing on the issue of abortion itself and abortion access, and maybe sort of tie this in, to paint Walker as hypocritical. But I think right now in the closing stretch of the campaign, Democrats, and I would assume those on the Warnock campaign, would probably want that story to do the work itself instead of focusing on it. They want to be focusing on the issues on Warnock's record in the Senate. Yeah, and there was a lot of, obviously not defense of the underlying scandal, but I saw many Republican pundits, commentators saying, what does it matter? We're for limiting abortion. He's for that. That is the important issue. Raphael Warnock is not for limiting abortion. So really encouraging the voters to overlook that. Probably you would expect that there are some people somewhere who might have voted for Herschel Walker, but are like, okay, this is one thing too many. I'm going to stay home or something, right? Yeah, it's very, very possible. And, on the issue of abortion, there was some polling that came out from Monmouth University yesterday, as well as Reuters, that shows that abortion actually isn't even in the top 5 issues among voters. I think in the Monmouth poll, it came in around 7. So I think Democrats, it's a good issue for their base. It's going to galvanize them, but I don't know if they can rely on it solely to get those independent swing
It's clear
voters.
This is coming down to inflation, the economy more broadly, and crime. I think really just like you're looking at the crime in especially places where things have gotten really bad, and some people, some voters do blame Democratic policies, and that it's continues to be a thorn in the party side, I think. Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that the Democrats are in control, whether it's in the White House or the Senate and the House, that's what I think you're going to see a lot of Republicans trying to, tie it back to them, even though arguably in some of these areas it's not necessarily the fault of the federal government. I'm curious to see how this plays in gubernatorial races and mayoral races across the country. We'll have to see. Yeah, very interesting. All right, Julia, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we'll have more Rising right after this.